What really excites me right now is a big project I'm doing focused on environmental discourses in Latin America. I'm primarily looking at how different groups such as community media, indigenous groups, government officials, industry people make meanings about environmental issues, particularly the impacts of extractive industries in the Amazon region. We're taking a decolonial approach to communication. Most of the work that is done in communication science assumes that different groups of people and individuals within these groups communicate in a very functional way. In the case of indigenous populations or marginalized groups, communication might take slightly different forms. For example, in the context of a community radio, the function of that is not necessarily or primarily to disseminate information, but it's largely to create community, to revitalize their culture, to revitalize and make sense of their own place within a country or a larger community. Things that we're finding is that in many community media and alternative media, journalists and communicators are already practicing a form of decolonial journalism. So again, it's not just dissemination of information or providing both sides to a story, for instance, in what we call a balanced story, but it's really about making visible what's invisible. And by that I mean that there are forces that have an impact on communities that come from hegemonic powers that are highly capitalist in nature, that completely marginalize and disregard the lived experiences of the indigenous groups or marginalized groups. Therefore, the communication that we see coming out of some of these independent or community or indigenous media just looks different. And we need to be able to embrace that difference and not reject it because it doesn't fit traditional standards of Western journalism. As part of this project, we've interviewed about 20 or more journalists, both in Peru and Bolivia, trying to understand how they perceive their own roles as journalists, as members of a community in communicating about environmental issues. And for the most part, journalists are highly aware of the inequities that exist based on the developmental model that has been imposed into most Latin American countries that you can trace back several decades into the 20th century or even beyond colonial times. And a lot of these issues have to do with colonialism and still are perpetuated in the form of coloniality. So they're very aware of these issues. They're also mindful about their fragile and risky position within media systems that are highly corrupted and that are highly dangerous for their own well-being. Many environmental journalists suffer from violence against them and threats against them. So these journalists have to balance those two things of being who they are and the values they believe that go beyond traditional journalistic values, objectivity or balance and those sort of things, and being more open about the inequities that exist and challenging a status quo that is largely based on an extractive form of economy. So they have to balance that with, again, with being mindful of their own well-being and their precarity in a media system that it's basically built for mainstream media dominated by strong and powerful economic forces. Another piece of this project includes the examination of disinformation campaigns that pollute the public sphere, particularly in Peru. Part of this includes attacks in the form of disinformation against environmental, non-governmental organizations, as well as indigenous groups, to try to delegitimize their position, their role, or their value as members of the society of the country, trying to make them less visible and less valuable contributors to economic development of the country. These are highly orchestrated and sophisticated disinformation campaigns that have attacked both environmental, non-governmental organizations, as well as some of these independent and community media. This is not new. This happens often in many Latin American countries where powerful interests, largely private industry, as well as foreign investments, try to oppose the legitimate rights of marginalized peoples. This project has been conducted in close collaboration with one of my doctoral students, Yasmin Amir dos Santos. Yasmin has been deeply involved with the research design, data collection, and data analysis. In addition, 2 undergraduate students have also collaborated in some of the fieldwork.